let's get started. Welcome to session 10 of our 19-part Illegal Drugs and Opioids in Indian Country series. Today's topic is Living Through Grief, Addressing Drugs on Our Reservations, and this is presented to us by Dr. Cheryl Ann Carey. I'm Tosha Tuhart. I'm the Director of Community Behavioral Health here at Great Plains Tribal Leaders Health Board. I oversee our Great Plains Tribal Opioid Response Program, as well as our Great Plains Native Connections Program. I will be your guest facilitator today. Great Plains Tribal Leaders Health Board is hosting this webinar series in collaboration among 4 of our programs here: the Great Plains Tribal Opioid Response, Great Plains Native Connections, HPOG, PHP, and the Great Plains Tribal Epidemiology Center. And funding for this series is supported by SAMHSA and the Administration for Children and Families. We're here and halfway through our webinar series, and I just wanted to take a minute to acknowledge all of the folks who work behind the scenes to make this webinar happen. So for our Zoom and Facebook masters, our staff from Great Plains Epidemiology Center, Brooke McPherson and Kelly Mulcher, our Great Plains Native Connections team, Maddie Thompson, who's our backup tech, and Haley Solik, who watches our Facebook commenting on the Hunkpati Ho-Chukka Agdi Facebook page. And our HPOG team, Barbara Schmidt and Jerry LeBeau, for bringing our speakers, students, and our partnership with Sitting Bull Community College to provide CEUs. And then from our Great Plains Tribal Opioid Response Program, Stacy Eagle Elk, who is our fearless leader in coordinating this series, bringing speakers, and being an amazing, fabulous facilitator. We miss her. And most importantly, I'd like to acknowledge everyone and who's been tuning in since we started each week as we dive deep into these really important issues that concern our tribal peoples. A couple of housekeeping: we are recording both on Facebook Live and on Zoom. I upload our videos weekly by every Friday on our webpage, and then also on our YouTube. And so access to our series webpage where you can watch past sessions, sign up on Zoom if you'd like to tune in via Zoom instead of Facebook, and see what's coming up in the future. I will post that link in the chat box. Questions could be entered in a Q&A box. If you're on Facebook, we have folks monitoring the Great Plains Tribal Leaders Health Board page for your comments and questions, as well as on the HHA page for our Crow Creek community. And of course, at the end of our session, please fill out our evaluations. We read those and take your feedback very seriously. So those links will be in the chat. So I'm done with that. We would like to welcome back our wonderful presenter, Dr. Cheryl Ann Carey. Dr. Carey is an enrolled member of the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe. She received her Bachelor of Science degree in Communications from the University of Mary, as well as a master's degree in Management and Business Administration. She holds a PhD in Communication and Public Discourse from the University of North Dakota. She has previously served as a curriculum development specialist at the Native American Training Institute, the research director at United Tribes Technical College, the executive director for the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, and a grants management specialist at the North Dakota Department of Health. In 2013, Dr. Carey was awarded a Bush Foundation Fellowship, under which she developed and conducted a survey of off-reservation American Indians in the Bismarck-Mandan area. This work helped her establish the Sacred Pipe Resource Center, which is a nonprofit organization serving the American Indian population in Bismarck-Mandan. She has worked with tribal communities and populations for the majority of her career. And in addition to professional responsibilities, Dr. Carey advocates for Native people and tribes in a variety of volunteer efforts. Thank you so much, Dr. Carey, for being with us. I will hand it off to you.
Okay, so as the meme says, let's get the seance started. Can everybody hear me? Can anybody hear me? Can anybody see me? Is there anyone there?
We can hear you, but we can't see you.
All right. Is the slide presentation showing?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, we'd rather look at the slides than look at me, so that's a good thing. I want to thank you very much for inviting me to do this presentation, and also to the participants who are participating in this session. I appreciate the opportunity to share with you. As I guess I'm not sure if we mentioned, but this is actually part 2 of the session that we did last week, which was the living through grieving and the perspective of cutting. This week we're expanding it a little bit although the focus will still be on cutting specifically, we've broadened the scope a little bit to talk about living through grieving and all of the various ways that we live through grief and we address grief as Native people, whether that's through alcohol or drugs specifically, or any other types of ways that we address this grief. So last week when we talked about cutting, we just to review for those of you who may be new, that we did talk a little bit about what cutting is, what are the signs, what are the symptoms. We talked about, we looked at the cultural underpinnings of cutting and some of the media portrayals that are inaccurate about the practice of cutting as it was done as a socially acceptable practice among tribes. So this session, we're going to get a little bit deeper into how do we bring that knowledge, that cultural knowledge of cutting into our practice, into our everyday practice, because that's kind of the big thing right now is how do we stop this from happening? How do we stop these drugs and alcohol from impacting our community, our youth? How do we address these issues in a culturally specific way where we're strengthening our communities? So I'm going to talk a little bit about this thing that we call disenfranchised grief and historical trauma. Because I think I meant this slide was in our other presentation, and but I want to recall your attention to this concept of disenfranchised grief, because I think this is something that we're dealing with in all of our tribal communities right now. So disenfranchised grief can be described as that grief that when we can't openly acknowledge or publicly mourn or deal with on a larger basis the trauma that we've gone through as Native people. Like the description says, Native people have been portrayed by the dominant culture as stoic and without feelings, incapable of grief. But I think this goes far beyond just a portrayal that we might see in mainstream media. There is actually, deliberate disavowal of the hurt, the trauma, the anger, and the injustice that we have gone through in our tribal communities. And I think part of changing our own tribal communities is acknowledging that we do have this disenfranchised grief, that there were deliberate attempts to stop our ways of dealing with trauma. The underlying message is always that, oh, there's no time for grief, you don't have a right to grieve, this is just how it is, just move on. And unfortunately, I think so much of what we need to do to respond to disenfranchise grief is to go back and to say, yes, we need to reclaim those ways of grieving. There's no way that we're going to get to healing without going through this, recognizing that we are grieving, that there's a grieving process, and two, reclaiming the cultural ways of responding to grief. So if you look back through history, that Native people had very specific ways of dealing with trauma and grief. And we talked about cutting as one of those ways, as being one of those socially accepted ways of dealing with deep trauma and deep grief. But if you look throughout history, we also had a lot of other ways that we dealt with trauma and grief, and all of those ways were disrupted. And so the things that we did specifically to deal with grief were either prohibited, banned, or forcibly or coercingly changed. So, for example, the burial rituals that we had, you'll see on the left-hand side of this slide, the burial rituals that we had specifically were prohibited by the ways that we did burials. So long ago, we had scaffolds. So there was very specific rituals that went along, burial rituals that went along. There was ceremony that was done, and then our bodies were either put on scaffolding or in trees, placed in trees, and so it wasn't the embalming and burial process that we use today. One of our greatest ceremonies, and I'm speaking again from a Dakota perspective because that's the tribe that I come from, but I know a lot of other Northern Plains tribes, and indeed tribes all across the US, have their own practices that were similar to this. But one of the greatest ceremonies that we had was the keeping and the wrapping of the body and the releasing of the spirit. So this ceremony allowed us to keep someone, when we were going to have like really deep trauma and grief over the loss of someone important to us, we had that keeping of the spirit. So we'd actually, so this ceremony was wrapping the body in a ceremonial way, and actually having a specific teepee for that body, and then it would travel with us. We would keep that spirit with us for 1 year, and at the end of that year, then we would release that spirit. And again, very specific ceremony for saying, this is extended trauma and grief that we're going through, and at the end of this year, then we release that spirit. And so for that prolonged grief, it was an actual acknowledgement that, you know, it's going to take us a lot longer to deal with this grief, and that was going to allow us to then release that spirit. And it was another ceremonial way of helping us let go of that grief and move on to healing. You know, just the recognition that sometimes that grief and trauma lasts longer than others. And this was a ceremony that was very definitely prohibited because, you know, ostensibly because of health reasons, that this is how we do it now. We embalm the body and we bury them so they're no longer seen. And so this was a great disruption in our communities, because if those of you who were at the session the last time, we talked about the rituals that went on. You know, there were community rituals that involved the giveaway and feeds and things like that. So we still have some vestiges, I guess, of those practices that we do today, where we say, okay, after a year, you know, then we have a memorial for our loved one. That helps us in some ways. We do have, you know, tournaments and things like that that allow us to sort of extend that trauma and grief, but we really don't have the ceremony. Those are things that have been prohibited then, that help us actually formalize that closing of grief and recognition of this trauma in our life. So the second one on the left-hand side, you see there the mourning ceremonies. Those were actually outright banned at one point through the Court of Indian Offenses. So we know that during the reservation era, the Court of Indian Defenses was actually a series of criminalizations of Native gatherings. So as we talked about, when we did the cutting and the burial ceremonies and the healing ceremonies, most of those were banned under the Court of Indian Offenses. So we couldn't have the social and community gatherings that helped us as community people, as collective people, to deal with trauma and grief. So that social and community aspect of grieving was banned, denied. And I think that's one of the really detrimental things that happened in our communities, because we weren't allowed to come together as a community and to get that social connection that helps with healing. So the third part then of our trauma and grief processes that was disrupted was the use of our spiritual leaders in our extended family. So a lot of our grief and our social connection networks that dealt with healing and helped us in that second phase of healing, not just recognizing the trauma and expressing our grief, but then also that last step of achieving healing, that was very much disrupted. So last session, we talked about this whole process of cutting being banned. Spiritual leaders were undermined. We had to use the church process. And so, you know, a lot those people who did turn to the churches were able to find some, you know, some sort of other process, but that coerced assimilation really disrupted the traditional way we had of using our spiritual leaders and extended family. And I think that's another way where our ways were disrupted and caused more trauma for us. So when we look at these, you know, how do we deal with widespread trauma and grief? You know, pretty much any way you look at it, our ways were disrupted. And what happens when you have a large community event that causes trauma, we as, you know, people who live in the United States, we look at an event like 9/11. So when 9/11 happened, when the two towers were crashed into with the airplanes, the whole nation went into this, you know, trauma phase. The whole nation was traumatized by this specific event. And if you'll recall, the response to this national traumatic event was, you know, we flew in counselors, grief counselors, and mental health workers into the site of 9/11. And, you know, we had kids all across the nation send, you know, cards, and we had ceremonies and, you know, commemorations of 9/11. There was this very concerted response to 9/11 and the national trauma that happened. But the CDC went back a year later into that region where 9/11 happened. And what they found was, even though we had this very concerted response, this very coordinated response to help that area deal with the trauma that happened with, you know, the crashing of these buildings, there were still massive increases in cigarette and tobacco use, in alcohol abuse, in suicide rates, in anxiety and depression rates. And so what they found was, even though we had a dedicated response, a knowledgeable, dedicated mental health response to this community trauma, there were still increases in all of these negative coping mechanisms. So when you think about that, it makes it even more pronounced, or even more traumatic, to say that in our tribal communities, there were these national, you know, wide-scale traumatic events that happened, and there was not a mental health response. There was not a way, there was not a communal way of dealing with that grief, a widespread communal way of dealing with that grief. It was just move on. And all of the ways that we did have for dealing with those events were stopped in many ways. And so I say this not to make us, resentful or to cast blame, but to say that this is the scope of what we're dealing with. We now have to go back and try to reclaim those ways of dealing with this trauma. So this is why historical trauma was such a phenomenal description of what we were going through. So when the founder, Maria Braveheart Jordan, came up with this concept of historical trauma, actually defined it. It really was a sense of relief where we could say, oh, that's what that is. So I was working with the Native American Training Institute at that time, and we were doing, foster care and social work training all across the United States. And really, no matter where we went, when we would present this definition of historical trauma, people would immediately recognize it and say, "Oh, yeah, that's what that is." They didn't know the technical definition of historical trauma, but they knew the experience. And so when they had the definition, they were like, oh, okay, yeah, that's what that is. I know what that is. So historical trauma, the definition, trauma upon trauma. So it's not just one isolated event, but several events, many events that happen again and again to a community, to a specific group of people. And I think this definition is very astute in that it also talks about the emotional and mental wounding that happens and in their generation and the generations that follow. So making that connection between the emotional impact and then what happens, how it impacts us mentally, how it wounds us both emotionally and mentally, and causes this cyclical behavior that we see in our tribal communities. In our generations and the generations that follow. So just like, the example that we use is if a child is abused and experiences child abuse, then they grow to expect violence, and it impacts their way of thinking that they will, expect violence. And then they teach their children as well how to protect themselves from violence. So this historical trauma is happened in our communities, and part of healing is recognizing that we have this generational trauma that has caused this emotional and mental wounding. This slide talks a little bit about what we've done just locally in the Bismarck, Mandan, Lincoln areas with our off-reservation population. So we've been doing a survey. We did one in 2014 to start the Sacred Pipe Resource Center. We did one in 2016. We weren't able to do 2018, but then we did also 2020. So we've got every 2 years survey data that shows, the profile of our American Indian population in this urban area. One of the questions that we ask is about trauma, and how have you come across trauma in your life? And as you can see, we ask the question, have you witnessed this specific trauma? Have you experienced this trauma? And the total from our population. So you can see that we have a great number of people in our community who have experienced or witnessed suicide. So 30% of our population has either witnessed or experienced suicide. Just shy of 30% of our population has experienced or witnessed rape or sexual assault. almost 60% of our population has either witnessed or experienced domestic violence. And a little over 40% of our population has either witnessed or experienced child abuse. So you can see, you know, just from this one very limited local data set, that we have a lot of trauma in our community. So, you know, if we're doing this type of survey data in all of our tribal communities, whether they're off-reservation urban tribal communities or on-reservation tribal communities, you're going to see these same types of phenomenal rates of trauma that we see in our communities. And I say that, you know, this is just one community. And these rates are very, very high for this one community. So if we do this same type of data gathering for all our communities, I think what you're going to see is that we do have very high rates of ongoing historical trauma and how it impacts our community. And the reason I say that is because we as a field, as fields, social work field, mental health field, social services fields, we're starting to see this emphasis on what's called trauma-informed care, right? So these fields are beginning to recognize the need to finally acknowledge that we have this trauma, and not just one instance of trauma, but this ongoing historical trauma that has impacted our community. So we're starting to see this term called trauma-informed care, right? Which is finally recognizing that that there are signs and symptoms and risks of this trauma, not just one form of trauma, but ongoing trauma. So you might have already also heard of adverse child experiences, or ACEs, toxic stress, those terminology that we're starting to use now to recognize this trauma that we have in our communities. And then, of course, for our Native communities, seeing that we also have the trauma of systemic poverty, intergenerational poverty, and racism and discrimination. Those are very specific experiences that our communities experience, that we also have to acknowledge and to deal with. So what we know about trauma-informed care is that this terminology means is that we have to change the way we do our practices so that we can, one, understand the prevalence of trauma and adversity and their impacts on health and behavior. So trauma-informed care means recognizing that there has been sustained trauma in our families. Trauma-informed care is recognizing the effects of that trauma and how it impacts not just our mental health, but also our physical health. And trauma-informed care is going beyond just recognizing that in our own practice, but also recognizing that we have to train our leadership, our providers, all staff on how we respond to patients that have sustained trauma. This means not just our own response, but the systemic response. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation, but sorry, get down. Sorry, my cat is wanting to do the presentation. So we'll talk a little bit about that later, but really changing our own response is just one part of the equation. A second part of the equation is how do we change systems so that they're more culturally responsive, they're more culturally appropriate, and they're helping us as tribal people in these positions to create culturally responsive ways of dealing with all of this trauma. Get down. Trauma-informed care means integrating knowledge about trauma and adversity into our policies, our procedures, our practices, and our treatment planning. So some of the things that I'll be talking about later in the presentation are really not these what do they call them? Evidence-based practices. We haven't caught up in terms of our field of research where we can say our cultural ways of dealing with trauma and grief are evidence-based practice. It's coming, but until we get there, we have to support the policies and procedures, practices, and our treatment planning that make space for cultural ways of addressing grief and trauma. And trauma-informed care also means resisting re-traumatization by helping patients who have these ACEs by opening up spaces where we're not judgmental about how we do things, because sometimes our fields, very much prescribe how we deal with trauma or how we deal with addictions, and they don't leave space for alternative ways, culturally based ways of dealing with trauma. And by that, I mean, we need to change our way of dealing with trauma to this next phase, which is healing-centered engagement. So I'm going to go back to this slide here a minute, because trauma-informed care, we're just starting to see this concept of trauma-informed care in our practices. And what our traditional culturally based practices call for is the step beyond trauma-informed care, which is this idea of healing-centered engagement. So this might be a terminology that not very many people have heard yet, but I think this is our next step. Healing-centered engagement is terminology that was coined by Dr. Sean Ginwright, and he is actually an African-American counselor, deals with mental health, and he coined this term healing-centered engagement because he worked a lot with African-American immigrants who were dealing with a lot of, the traumas, the intergenerational traumas of, war, outright war in their countries, displacement, and then being immigrants or refugees in their own countries because of war. Does that sound familiar? If it does, it greatly mirrors the Native experience of, war, displacement, and then becoming, basically refugees in our own land, and the reservation experience. And so this idea of healing-centered engagement came about because as he was dealing with African immigrants and people who were experiencing this trauma and this displacement, and he was coming at it from a trauma-informed stance and saying, talking about their trauma and how did they deal with their trauma. And what he was hearing from a lot of the people that he was working with was, we are much more than our trauma. We are not our trauma. We are human beings who want to reclaim our identity and our healthy ways of being. And so I really like this idea of healing-centered engagement because it focuses not on the trauma, the focus is on the healing. And so these are some of the principles that Dr. Sean Ginwright is developing as he, fleshes out this idea of healing-centered engagement. So one of the, this similarity of this African immigrant experience with us really has so these principles really have a lot of ability to be replicated in our tribal communities. So one of the principles, of course, as you see here, is that it's very culturally grounded. Healing-centered engagement is culturally grounded, and it views healing as a restoration of our identity. So if you think about how in our tribal communities, a lot of the things that we're seeing that are very successful for healing go back to this idea of restoring our identity. And this comes from a very much a BIPOC or a Black, Indigenous, people of color perspective, that reclaiming our ancestral ways of healing, reclaiming our identity is really a person of color perspective. It's not the outsider view that, oh, you have to heal yourself. You have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You have to become this, worker, consumer type of community member. This view says we are community-based, social-oriented people, and that is tied up in our collective identity. And so this whole idea of healing-centered engagement reinforces this idea of restoring our identity as tribal people and reclaiming our ways of being. The other principle that I think is really important and connects with us as tribal people is that we want to focus on being an asset-based, a strength-based community that focuses on being healthy rather than oh, stop what you're doing, stop this way of, suppressing or denying your feelings. So as I mentioned before, this healing, the purpose of healing is not so that we can be a worker or a consumer or, this capitalist sort of view of society, but so that we can be a healthy relative, so that we can be a good relative to the relatives that are in community. Because we are, at the core of our being, a relative to other people, a part of our collective tribe and our tribal communities. And so our health, the overall purpose of our health is not to be a consumer, not to be a worker, but to be a good relative. So this healing-centered engagement really looks at what is your strength and what is right with you. What knowledge do you have? What ancestral knowledge do you have? Do you carry with you? What's your ancestral birthright that's right with you, rather than focusing on the trauma and what happened to you or what's wrong with you. And I think that asset-based, that strength-based viewpoint is really healing for us as tribal communities. A principle of healing-centered engagement is also the recognition that trauma is not an individual isolated experience. And so that those of us who are healers or people who are wanting to help our communities heal, we also are impacted by trauma. So, we have to be part of the healing process as providers as well. So we're not unaffected. We're not, disassociated, outsiders that are looking at these people that need to be healed from the outside. We also are part of healing, and because we've been traumatized as well. So healing-centered engagement supports the healing of providers and the journey that we have to be, the terminology I like is wounded healers. So as healers, we've been wounded ourselves, and that wounding allows us to have an insider view of healing. So we are wounded healers in the sense that we are walking alongside those of us that have trauma. And so we can't disassociate ourselves with that. We have to be a part of that. We are all wounded, and we can use that wounding to create healing. That is really the core of healing-centered engagement, is how can we take our own wounding and help heal, co-heal our communities. So I think that's a very unique tribal response, because we're all in this together. We're collective people. We believe in social connectedness and being a good relative. The fourth principle of healing-centered engagement that I think is really relevant to us as tribal people is that it's rooted in our community experience. And so it's explicitly political rather than clinical. So what I've been saying, we don't heal as individuals, we heal as a community. And so I don't use the term political in the sense of, political parties or that sort of thing, but it's the process is rooted in the fact that we have to help our entire community heal, our systems heal, not just individuals. So it's a very holistic viewpoint that involves our culture, our spirituality, our civic action, healing our systems, reclaiming our systems, and that collective healing. So in the sense that it's political, in the sense that we have to help heal our communities. We have to be involved in our tribal governments. We have to be involved in our city and state governments. We have to be involved in what's going on around us, because what's going on around us impacts us on a daily basis. So this fight in Flint, Michigan for clean water, that has to involve civic action if we want to help people heal on an individual basis. We have to be involved in our community and healing on a collective basis as well. So I think this whole concept, and I'll talk a little bit more about healing-centered engagement, but I just wanted to put that out here as a new terminology that's happening, and something that I think that has some relevance, for some very deep relevance for our tribal communities as we move forward in this concept of healing and dealing with trauma. I say this specifically because we need to change this view of our systems and how we deal with individual trauma to dealing with it in a collective way. So in the last session, we talked about this negative cycle of self-injury, specifically for cutting. So we have depression, we have anxiety. We look to cutting because that's one way of dealing with it. So cutting provides us with a sense of relief. And so then we have an intervention, right? A mental health or a community social services type of intervention. Somebody's cutting. So we use this intervention, and a lot of times that involves, sending someone to the psych ward, or trying to prevent someone from cutting. There's an intervention there that happens, and that creates this sense of shame. I shouldn't be doing this. A lot of times our interventions are very no-based, right? Don't do that. Don't drink. Don't use drugs. Don't cut. Don't. So we always hear this idea of what we can't do. So it's very negative based versus a strengths-based intervention. What can we do, right? So that intervention a lot of times leads to that shame. Oh, I shouldn't be doing this. And so it creates more anxiety that creates this negative cycle. What Living Through Grieving, this response to cutting, advocates for is creating supports and cultural knowledge building that ties this idea of cutting to grieving. This is what we're doing. We're using a socially a practice that was once socially acceptable, that is now no longer socially acceptable, as a way of relief. And so when we use our cultural knowledge, that cultural knowledge building, what we're saying is when you're cutting, you're grieving. So acknowledging that we're grieving, that we need to have a culturally based response to this grief. And that's what provides this relief that sense of relief actually needs that next step, which is that healing step. So this negative cycle of self-injury, we can substitute anything really for that cutting, whether it's numbing yourself through the use of alcohol or drugs, or whatever, eating, sex, any type of system, that negative coping mechanism that you're using can be seen in this negative cycle of self-injury. So what we're saying is we have to replace this negative cycle with a positive cycle, with that support and that cultural knowledge building. And this is especially alarming when we consider the new types of drugs that we're seeing in our tribal communities, because in the past, a lot of the ways that we've dealt with this grief have been finding ways to numb the pain, right? But the drugs that we are seeing in our communities now they go beyond just numbing the pain, because the new drugs that we're seeing are actively engaging the pleasure centers of the brain. So the meth, it doesn't just do the numbing that alcohol has done for us in the past. It's actually activating pleasure centers of the brain. And so that it makes it even more alarming, because now they're activating these false sense of pleasure rather than healing. So we want to, it's even more important for us now to get our young people to recognize that they're dealing with trauma, and there are other ways that work to get through this grief, so that we can get to this point of healing ourselves. So it's kind of a crisis. We've reached a crisis point, because we're not only now having to turn people to recognize that they have to go through this grief process, we're also saying it's not, you have to go away from these drugs that are stimulating those pleasure centers of our brain. So it's a little bit more critical right now that we really try to create those supports and that cultural knowledge building, so that we can address the trauma. So when we talk about healing-centered engagement, turning our attention to supports and strengthening our cultural knowledge and our cultural responses to trauma. So when we do that, we really, the focus is incorporating and building that cultural knowledge. So how do we do that? One of the ways we do that is to recognize every community is different. So every community has ancestral knowledge and resilience related to healing. And what are the practices that we still have in our communities, in our families, that are healing, that are strong, healthy healing practices? Every community has those. So I'm going to ask participants to think about healing in your own family, in your own local community. Think about a traumatic experience that you may have gone through recently, and whether it's the loss of a loved one, maybe your own assault or traumatic experiences, the loss of a home, maybe a flooding, a recent flooding or fire or tragedy, something like that in your community. Think about that experience. I'm going to just give a couple minutes of silence here for you to go through these questions and think about, just answer these questions in your own mind or on your own sheet of paper. Are you healed from that experience? And you can define that however you want to define that. What could anyone have done to make you heal faster? 3, what was helpful to you in your healing? 4, what was not helpful? And finally, were your children and or your family affected? And if yes, how so? So I'm just gonna shut down here. So there's gonna be some silence. Don't freak out. For you to just kind of do some self-reflecting for a minute before I come back and talk a little bit more about this. So just do a little self-reflection exercise for a minute. Okay, so I know that isn't near enough time to go through a personal exercise like this, and that's the unfortunate time limitations that we have and Zoom limitations that we have. But I just wanted to go through, just give an opportunity for a little bit of self-reflection about healing, because I think it's important for us to think about our own experiences with healing in order to sort of tease out the things that are helpful and not helpful in healing, and to help us understand how we can sort of indigenize the healing process, right? How we can use our own personal experiences as wounded healers to impact the way that we work with children and adults and families in this arena. So having some experience of doing lots and lots of different trainings where we've done this exercise, I can tell you, we'll just go through these questions a little bit, because one of the core things we know about healing is, one, are you healed? And 9 times out of 10 people will say, are you ever really healed? You're never really healed in the sense that it goes away and you never think of it again, and you never deal with the trauma again. So saying that the whole concept of being healed is a really nebulous one, because we're never really healed, right? We always carry a scar. So it's just like a actual physical wound where you can say, yes, I am healed in the sense that the wound is no longer bleeding, but I will always have this scar, right? So I think that helps us indigenize the experience of dealing with trauma, in the sense that we all are wounded healers. So we can take the experience that we have to help others. And I know that's a lot of why, you know, people who maybe are recovering addicts go into substance abuse field, for example, because we have something to share. And that's a central core of healing-centered engagement, which is, we need to bring that personal experience in order to have this idea, in our Dakota language, we say wa'unshila, this compassion, this ability to sit along someone else and really feel for them. You have to have your own personal experience with trauma to be effective in doing that. So I think that's one of the things that, how do we indigenize this process? We can say we are wounded healers. The question that asks, what could anyone have done to make you heal faster, is sort of a trick question, because what we know about trauma is that it's not on a timeline, and nobody can make anybody else heal any faster. Everybody has to go through trauma at their own pace. So what we know about this question, this part of healing, is that healing happens on its own timeline. But when we support people, we help them move on a track towards healing, versus what is not helpful to people is when people try to rush them along in healing. So the recognition that everybody heals at their own pace. The third question, what was helpful to you in your healing, is again, part of a central core to healing-centered engagement. Because what was helpful to you in your healing a lot of times is, again, people offering support, just listening to your story, allowing you to tell your story, sitting with you in a compassionate way, maybe going through a healing process or a ceremony with you. And then what was not helpful. So what's helpful to you in your healing and what's not helpful to you are really personal experiences that you bring to the table that you can also help indigenize. So things that are not helpful, platitudes, people trying to rush you through the process, those are things that you can bring to your practice. And then the last question, were your children and your family affected? Again, having done this exercise a million times, the answer to this question is always yes. And, and in a lot of different ways, so that the answer to this question, yes, lets us know that this ongoing trauma and healing has to involve a social connection. We as Native people come from a collective culture, but a lot of times the processes that we see in our clinical teachings or our non-Native based teachings is that healing is an individual process. But when we see this question, were your children and family affected? Yes, they were affected. We live in a collective culture, and so that healing a lot of times has to be collective as well. So what we know about the process of healing is that sorry, got stuck there for a minute. What we know about the process of healing is that, one, it is a process. So it isn't something that you can just jump into. And this, again, this is especially prevalent with this in this healing-centered engagement process, because healing-centered engagement recognizes the process, that healing is a process. So the first step is acknowledging loss. So we talked specifically about in the last session of cutting, that when young people cut, or when young adults cut, we can specifically say cutting is a cultural practice that we used for grieving. And we can point to, because you're going through a process of grief, that there's a loss there. So defining that loss, is it a loss of innocence, maybe, when we're sexually abused, a loss of trust, maybe when we're physically abused, a loss of our childhood when we're, when we go through trauma and have to become the adult in the family. So there's a loss there. It's not necessarily a physical death, but there's a loss of something. And so whatever type of negative coping mechanism we're using, whether it's alcohol, drugs, whatever, there's a loss involved there. So healing involves acknowledging that there's a loss, some sort of loss. A big part of healing-centered engagement is telling our story. And this is especially important because we're storytelling people. We're very we-oriented. And so a lot of times, the healing process is very individualized in our systems, where in order to indigenize our systems, we have to become very we-oriented and provide opportunities for people to tell that story as many times as that story needs to be told. Because sharing pain helps lessen that pain. We know that from our traditional cultural practices, our grieving practices. So we have to have those opportunities and mechanisms in our practices that allow us to tell that story as many times as it takes. Accepting support is an important part of the process of healing that a lot of times our practices don't allow us to incorporate. So asking for help is a very culturally based practice. We have to learn how to ask for help. That goes back to this concept of humility, one of our core cultural beliefs in humility, in being able to ask for help. So part of the process of healing is putting ourselves in a place where we know how to ask for help from a spiritual leader, maybe from a relative, maybe that has this experience, but reclaiming that practice of humbly asking for help from our community. And so we need to support practices and maybe even reteach ways of asking for help, taking tobacco to someone and saying, I need help in a good way. I'm asking for your knowledge. I'm asking for your support. Connecting, part of the process of healing is connecting current behavior with the original wound. And I think that's that self-reflection piece that, our practices really, this is one area where our practices, clinical practices really focus on self-reflection. But I'm going to talk in a little bit about communication and how that impacts that. So we do have that self-reflection piece in our current practices, but a lot of times we need to go one step further, and that is, how do we communicate that? How do we reflect, communicating with ourselves? The next part of the process of healing is separating the past from the present. That's where this concept of healing-centered engagement is especially helpful, because it focuses on how can my individual healing facilitate healing with the collective. So I think that separating the past from the present means recognizing that historical trauma and how it's impacted us. And then the last piece of healing is creating a new story, which is integrating that trauma. And again, that's the core piece of healing-centered engagement is, how can I be a wounded healer? How can I be a healer for others? So we talked in the last session, in the first part of this, about cutting specifically from a Native perspective of how does one incorporate an actual pain into healing. And this is a very, central Native perspective to the Sundance. This idea that we suffer for the people. It's a sacrifice that we make in this sense of prayer. So this perspective obviously has a little more relevance to this idea of cutting, but I think it also has relevance in our healing practices, because when we suffer, the outcome is resurrection, renewal, restoration, forgiveness. So in other words, making this whole concept a core of our healing practices, that people who have gone through pain, pain serves a purpose. And that's, I think, a central tenet of Native perspectives, is that you go through pain in order to achieve healing. And I think sometimes we forget that. We forget that key grieving healing process, that connection. And so this idea of pain, that pain serves a purpose, is something that we as Native people have had for centuries. And in fact, it's what precipitated this whole idea of disenfranchised grief, that, oh, we're stoic people, we handle pain so well. Native people, the white gaze, when non-Native people came to this country and they saw Native people experiencing pain in a very stoic way, they're, oh yeah, that's, they just handle pain that way. But it wasn't that it wasn't that we enjoyed pain or that we didn't feel pain. It was that we as Native people knew that you had to go through pain in order to heal. And so I think that we need to reclaim that central cultural tenet of understanding that you have to go through pain in order to heal. You have to feel that in order to heal. And so by numbing it, we never get to that healing place. So we didn't have, as Native people, an aversion to pain. So, a lot of times we see, we had ways also of numbing pain. Of course, we had our medicines, but those medicines were not meant to completely avoid pain. Part of our tribal knowledge is recognizing the function of pain, and that is that we need to heal. So we have this what I call the backpack, our Native experience backpack with trauma. And this trauma really impacts the way we communicate about trauma. So again, this is the second piece why we have to reclaim our traditional cultural practices, because communication is definitely impacted by this sustained trauma. So I also do a presentation on a Lakota Dakota model of oratory, or how we do public speaking and how we communicate. Of course, my degree is in communications, and I have a special interest in how we communicate, or in some cases, how we don't communicate as Native people, because how we speak is very much culturally based. Even though we as Native people use the English language, we still use the English language in a very culturally based way. And this causes a lot of confusion, I think, because our way of communicating isn't really congruent with the processes and the practices that are taught in social services and mental health. A lot of the ways that we are taught to communicate are based on the idea of diplomacy and storytelling. And that a lot of times comes in conflict with non-native expectations of just tell me what's wrong so we can, get to the problem. So a lot of times we want to tell stories. We're storytelling people, whereas a lot of times the expectation is just tell me what's wrong so I can give you the medicine to fix it, right? So our what we carry with us is not just the trauma, but then the inability to express that trauma. So for example, we have historical trauma and disenfranchised grief. We have this experience that causes a lot of mistrust. Mistrust in telling people what's wrong, telling people of the trauma that we might have experienced. For example, child abuse. No, we don't share that because then kids will get taken away. Or we don't share about domestic violence because then someone will get locked up and taken away. So this historical trauma and disenfranchised grief impact the way we communicate because we no longer share because we mistrust. It also reinforces some limited language patterns. We'll talk about that in a minute, but our brain changes because of that emotional and mental wounding, and that impacts the way that we are able to communicate. So we're not always able to communicate as effectively as we can because of that trauma and that grief. We know that we have there's a lot of wide body of knowledge about adverse childhood experiences. So what we know about sustained trauma and adverse childhood experiences is that it has an impact on our neurodevelopment. We know that the sustained trauma creates these epigenetic influence as well. So that has an impact, and it decreases our resilience factors, not just our mental health resilience, but our actual physical resilience factors. And then we know that there is generational poverty that overlays all of this, and that it's very difficult for us to communicate because we don't always know these hidden rules of communication. So again, there's another body of research out there. Ruby Payne is probably the most well-known researcher who talks about generational poverty and its impact on our ability to communicate. Most of the systems that we utilize, the teachings that we utilize or that we base our systems on are based on the middle class. And the middle class has a very specific way of communicating that those who come from generational poverty are not aware of. So when I say hidden rules, it's hidden rules of how you communicate, the types of language that we use. For example, we as Native people are very much storytellers. The hidden rules of middle class language is, if I ask you a direct question, I expect a direct answer. So for example, if someone who in the mental health field is asking a question about trauma or addiction, and they ask a question, a lot of times as Native people, we'll tell a story. Instead of answering the question directly, we'll tell a story because we're trying to share our experience. And then the practitioner is like, no, I don't want to hear the story. I want to know why. So there's some communication, miscommunication that happens because of that. So the reason I'm bringing all of this up is because I think we have to be aware of the language impacts as well when we're talking about trauma. what we know about trauma is that it impacts us in a physiological way. So many times when we go through sustained trauma, it impacts the way we communicate, because a traumatized brain moves away from language and verbal content. And when we're in a lot of sustained trauma, we tend to then become fixed on nonverbal rather than verbal. So we look for those danger cues, body movements, am I going to get hit? So we're conscious more of body movements, facial expressions. Is somebody angry, and is that going to, mean that I'm going to get abused in some way? So we're paying more attention to tone of voice, facial expression, body movements, body language. That is that primitive brain that's protecting us from further trauma. So when we're protecting ourselves, we can't process language in the ways that the middle class expects us to describe how we're feeling. So it limits that language that a lot of times we're expected to use to describe trauma and explain how we're feeling. So this compounds some of the issues that we have in dealing with trauma, and why healing-centered engagement is and moving to our cultural practices is so important. We need to make time to be able to reclaim language and reclaim storytelling, and being able to pull from the stories that we're telling those key things that tell us about how we need to, what we're grieving and how we can heal from that. And I think just from my own experience in our communities with Native people is that, we tend to have high emotional intelligence. And so emotional intelligence really also relies on the nonverbal body language and facial expressions. So in addition to, trauma creating these movements away from language and verbal, we also just naturally have a tendency to be more clued in because we have higher emotional intelligence. And I think that's, I think as we do more research into this, we'll find that this also is another reason why we need to change our practices to be more emotionally based and storytelling based. What we know about grief is that when we go through grieving, we seek comfort. Grief seeks comfort. So whether that's alcohol addictions, drug addictions, all the other types of addictions that we have out there, we are seeking what we're doing when we go through that is we're seeking comfort. But a lot of times our systems are focused on the don'ts, right? Don't do this, don't do that, stop overeating, stop using drugs, stop gambling. So we don't really think about the healing piece. What our cultural practices allow us to do is to focus on that healing piece. So when we start talking about healing, even the term healing-centered engagement focuses on healing rather than trauma, right? So trauma-informed care versus healing-centered engagement. So how do we help with that healing? How do we help change our systems and our own practices so that we're focusing on healing? So one of the first things I think is what I've been kind of harping on, I guess, in a sense, repeating, is that when we incorporate the cultural knowledge about grief and healing, we give them an understanding, the young people that we work with, of how they seek comfort. So we know that grief, anger, hurt, shame, frustration, depression, all of these things, anxiety, they are very strong emotional feelings. And so by recognizing and naming these things and saying, this is all part of grief and healing, and what you are doing is going through a grief process and that needs to be healed. So helping them identify what that loss is, what are you losing? So some of the things that very specifically that service providers, I think, can do in their own practice and their own strategies is to help Native people learn to identify feelings. So a lot of times we have, as I mentioned, we have difficulty identifying emotions. I'm going to use this healing wheel. I know this is something that is used in a lot of practices, mental health practice, counseling practices. But I think this is really helpful because when we don't have those words to express what we're feeling, it's very difficult for us to pinpoint loss. So I'll use my own son as an example. I mentioned in the last session that I noticed that one of my sons was cutting. And so in visiting with him, he could not identify really this anxiety that he was feeling. All he knew was that he was feeling very anxious. He wasn't able to say, what that where it was coming from or why he was feeling this way. He just knew that for the moment this cutting was helping him. So we sat down and we talked about, where does this anxiety come from? Okay, what are you feeling? Well, he was feeling scared. He was feeling like too much pressure. The cutting was relieving that pressure. And so we just kept drilling down. I just kept asking question after question after question. Well, what is what are you scared of? What is the feeling that you're of anxiety? When does it occur? So a lot of it came down to the pressure that he was feeling as he was starting his senior year of school. A lot of, I was taking some advanced classes. He was feeling like he was falling behind. He had a lot of activities. He was feeling like, what happens if I'm a failure? I'm going to be, it's going to impact my future. So we talked about the worst case scenario. What's the worst that could happen? And, the idea that, what he was feeling then was this loss of control. So what we drilled down to is, what kind of loss are you experiencing? He was feeling this sense of loss of control. He was feeling a sense of loss of proficiency. He was out of, he couldn't handle it. He was feeling very insignificant, very discouraged. So we identified some of these words that helped him identify the sense of loss. And then we looked at, okay, well, what's the worst case scenario? You are not changing who you are because of the sense of loss. And how can we then address, how can we help you find a way of healing rather than using this cutting as a coping mechanism? So we helped him identify, or I helped him identify these feelings using that feeling wheel. And then we talked about those feelings and what were the triggers. So one of his triggers was when he had deadlines coming up. So we talked about, okay, how can we help you identify healthier ways of dealing with these deadlines and, all of these things that are coming at you at one time. Let's do, a long-term calendar so that what is all coming. I went with him to talk with some teachers that he was a little bit afraid of talking with teachers. So I'm just giving you some examples of, ways that we was able to go through the process with him. Now, again, this is very time intensive and very specific things that I was going through him with. And this is what I'm saying, like reclaiming our traditional processes of doing things, because a lot of times our systems don't allow for this. Our systems don't allow us to give the time, the individualized time, to help people through this questioning process. They don't give us time to use modeling, to look at videos, to do role plays, to help people talk about feelings. And I think those are the things that we have to reclaim as cultural processes. I think, so again, going back to the main topic that we were talking about, which is cutting, is helping provide alternatives. So we know that, you know, a lot of times the negative coping mechanisms that we use are not the answers. They're just a part of the journey towards the answers that are healing. So I think that expanding our cultural practices, making space for our cultural practices is really what's helpful, and providing those as alternatives. So what we can do is this, you know, we don't say no. So, and I think our definitely our fields are moving towards being more asset and strengths based than they have in the past, but also making sure that we don't say no, because again, that oh, you shouldn't be doing that, don't do that, those are things that bring the negative judgment connotations to it. So again, this idea of grief seeks comfort. So when we say no, that's not providing comfort. We know that what they're looking for is comfort. So helping provide a different way of seeking comfort. What are other ways that we can seek comfort? So developing that network of healing alternatives. And again, that's one of the reasons why we went through this little healing self-reflection exercise, is for you to really start looking at what's in your own wheelhouse, what's in your own community, because it'll be different for every community. It'll be different for every place. So some of those alternatives, we'll give you some examples. This idea of naming. So when I was at the Training Institute, we actually had a project, a wraparound project, and the research, the evaluation and research piece that we did there showed that one of the most effective interventions was giving young people an Indian name. The kids who had the lowest rates of recidivism were those who got an Indian name. And it was you know, when you think about it, it's a small thing, but it was very powerful for these young people who were grieving a loss of identity and a loss of self. And so by getting an Indian name, it allowed them to be a part of a community with a sense of identity. And so for us, it really came as no surprise that, you know, giving a young person an Indian name was a positive intervention. But for the systems, you know, it was very, you know, we had to go through this evaluation process to show them that this was something that was a positive intervention. So our systems were not equipped to consider something like that being an intervention. I mentioned the Center for Mind-Body Medicine because that's one entity or organization that is actually moving to using more culturally based interventions as what we call, what they call evidence-based practices. So the Center for Mind-Body Medicine actually looks at how is meditation, how is prayer, how is fasting, how are those things actually research-based practices that we can incorporate into the interventions that we use. So those things are coming, I think. I think we need to keep our eyes on those, because those are the things that will, where we can actually use as we write grants, as we expand our services, as we expand the programs that we use, as we help change our systems to be more culturally congruent to our traditional ways of healing. And then I think the last thing is, as I mentioned before, is teaching and modeling how to ask for help, because we do have traditional practices that incorporate those traditional values of compassion and humility, so that we're asking for help in a really spiritual way. Another thing I think service providers can do is, as I mentioned, offering these coping strategies in whatever ways the system allows us to do. I think we can incorporate these ways as much as possible, because we did have things that are, I think that are fairly easy to use and incorporate it, so that you're not going against any types of procedures or policies that your system may have that may prevent you from doing these things. So sweats are already, a fairly common practice that systems will allow to be used. I think they're familiar enough. But other things you can use is like a wiping of tears ceremony. I think those things are really helpful, especially for young people to have that social connection and ceremony, and that recognition, that community recognition that they've gone through trauma and that they need to go through a healing process. I think other things are prayer and fasting. Those are things that can be done. I think community feeds, any practices, small practices, are ways that we can create social connectedness. Because I think, again, social connectedness is the one thing that we leave out of a lot of our current practices, or that the non-native systems leave out of current practices. And again, that's the core of who we are as Native people, that social connectedness. I think supervisors can do other things or provide other alternatives, things that are recognized as traditional healing practices. I mentioned in the first session this idea of crying or wailing. I think there's a new terminology for, like, going out in nature and screaming. They call I forget what the terminology is, but it's this practice, this therapy of just going out and just screaming. But the connection is not lost on us, because this was a traditional grieving mechanism of crying or wailing really loud, not stopping someone from crying when they need to cry, and not stopping someone from actually just really crying in a very loud and self-healing way. I think it's important because we, a lot of times our social norms today is that we don't cry, or that we cry softly. So this is reclaiming our practice of wailing, I think, is important. I think grief clothing is important. We see a lot of young kids, that's one of the signs when they wear black, these emo colors. I know that in some of the interventions that we've used with sources of strength, one of the indicators that young people are doing better is when they start to wear colors. This is one thing that I used with my son who was cutting. Is I noticed that he just was always wearing gray or black. And so we actually made a conscious decision to go clothes shopping and to buy him clothes that had bright colors on them, and or that had messages on there, the little t-shirts that had the messages on the front. And it was just a way of having him express himself through what he was wearing. Physical activity, I think that's really important. Talking with older relatives, those are things that we could do. Honorings and remembrances, I think those are important, especially when we can talk about history and also provide educational opportunities for young people to know this is what has happened in our past and this is why things are the way they are. Because a lot of times they don't know and they don't understand, and that also leads to that feeling of shame. If we remember, when you go through, when you're a younger person, yeah, why is there poverty on my reservation? Why is it poor? They need to know that it isn't because we don't know how to, be business people, or it's not because we're just poor people. It was a very deliberate thing to bring to, taking of resources that leads us to have poverty. So I think those things help our young people understand that there's nothing wrong with you. This system is not because of you. So I think incorporating that learning of history is really, really important, not just of tribal history, but also of their own family history too. A lot of times, finding out that maybe you have a leader in your family is important. I think incorporating any kind of honorings, I think is helpful. One of the things that we're doing as an intervention here locally is providing opportunities for young people who aren't necessarily connected to their communities. So for example, young Native people who are in foster care, we're as a nonprofit organization helping them have a giveaway, getting them resources so that they can have a giveaway and get a traditional name. Or if they want to do like a graduation ceremony where they get, we provide feathers for them when they graduate, and then items for them to have a small giveaway. So that's just reinforcing those positive community, social-based connections that they need for healing. And then we mentioned in the first session, so for those of you who aren't here, we mentioned the whole concept of Aya, which is when you're going through grieving, you can either develop very good habits or you can develop bad habits. And so just making young people aware of Aya. So if you're feeling really badly, to put your attention to positive things, because that helps you develop positive coping mechanisms and positive habits. So, and this goes back to what we talked about in the first session, which is when you help young people identify something maybe that they've lost, you help them go through this mourning process, and then you help them find positive places to turn their energy. So we shared an anthropological description of a ceremony where a community lost a great leader in their community, and they had this ceremony, and the spiritual leader, this anthropologist described that the spiritual leader did the speech in the community and basically told he would advise the men, go hunting, and he would advise the women, make moccasins and bead and provide the feast for the community, because those are positive things that you'll turn your energy to in those first 4 days. So we as Dakota believe that when those first 4 days after somebody passes are days when you are most vulnerable. You are closest to the Creator because you're in deepest mourning. And so those first 4 days, it's important for you to turn your energy to something positive. And so by explaining these processes to young people, we can also explain to them, you know, when you go through grief, when you're grieving, it's important for you to turn your attention to positive things. So it could be the physical things like running or, you know, basketball or any other kind of sport, or it could be even something as small as going for a walk out in nature, you know, reconnecting with nature. You can find positive places to turn your attention that are spiritual, praying or going to a sweat. It could be mental-based things like beading, painting, or any type of creating where you're creating something, just drawing something. Or it could be emotional, where you sit and talk to a support group or write in a journal. So these are all positive things that we can point young people to. Don't do the negative things when you're feeling badly, because that'll create negative habits, but turning our energy to positive things. That's a cultural tradition that we can point young people to. And then the last thing I wanted to mention was about just knowing the difference between, you know, we have these co-occurring disorders sometimes, and just being able to identify when there's need for further or stronger professional help. So sometimes, and especially with cutting, that there's deeper mental health problems that, you know, where they need further counseling, more deliberate counseling and more deliberate help. So I just wanted to mention that, because I think there are things that we can do that are cultural, but I think it's also important to know when they need more intensive therapy that may involve, you know, chemical imbalances and things like that. So basically, what this all comes down to is this idea of how do we change our systems so that we can incorporate things that are culturally relevant, that are culturally congruent, that are culturally based, whatever terminology you want to use. But the idea that we need to change our systems so that we're using these things in a more deliberate way, in a more systemic way. And what that involves is this whole changing of our systems. So it goes from what we can do on an individual level in our own practice to what we can do on a institutional level or within your organization, to actually what can we do to the entire system so that we're creating more of these what they call evidence-based practices that are cultural, that we know will work in our communities with our Native youth. So this idea of, you know, there's steps to creating this healing-centered engagement as a process for our communities. And I think this is something I'm definitely interested in, and I would encourage everyone on this to learn more about healing-centered engagement. I know that Dr. Jinwright, who is leading this movement, is actually working on creating a certificate so that you can get certified in healing-centered engagement, and that'll be coming this fall. So I think that's something that people would want to keep an eye on. We've got a few minutes left for questions. I believe that I should leave, you know, a few minutes for questions, and if anybody has any questions or comments or things that you want to share as well, we're sure open to that. So I want to thank you all for listening. I appreciate it. I know Zooms are hard, so I very much appreciate your time and attention.
Well, Pila, Dr. Carey, Your words have such power and wisdom. We actually have a few comments and a question in the chat. So our first comment came when you were talking about the wounded healer. Someone said, "This is such a powerful conversation. I love it. I just heard that term last week, wounded healer, in a podcast with Paul Chek and Paul Levy." And then another person, and I think this was in terms of the healing reflection, they mentioned working with the 12 steps and having sponsors help them heal. And it's a continuous process for them. They have to learn to forgive themselves. Another person said Nari Chaje, and that is the Lakota word for spirit name. So when, and I believe they were referring to when we do the naming ceremony, that name is acknowledged and recognized in the spirit world. So thank you for that, Mike. And then Galena asked, where can we get this data for receiving their Indian name so that they can show it at their school?
I can put you in touch with, so the project that did that is completed, the grant project, but I can put you in touch with the person that has like the final report and all that data.
That
I'll
would
get
be
your,
amazing.
you have your email address there? Yeah, I'll get that.
Okay, you see it in the chat?
Yep.
Okay, and then Sean mentioned, and I think this was going back to those positive ways of healing. The run and scream traditional game, super fun and effective.
Yeah.
I love that game actually. And then we have some other comments. Yeah, and I actually have a couple of questions. One, I think someone's asked before, but are your slides they're not available now, but would you be willing to share your slides?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So if you, I'll get in touch with you, and then we will share those with participants through email, and of course our webpage where we are posting all of our past recordings. Second,
yeah, my email is there too, so if anybody wants to email me directly, they can do that. I do think I was going to mention, I forgot to mention about the calling of the spirit too. I know that in South Dakota they've actually incorporated that as one of the practices too, and I think that, you know, there's a lot more that can be said about that, you know, helping Native youth reclaim their spirit. And I think that's, you know, that's part of what we're trying to do. And just what this presentation really is about is like trying to expand this whole range of things that we can do for Native kids, because right now we're very limited in what we do. You know, the types of interventions and the types of responses that we do are very limited. And the reality is, when we look to culture that expands our you know, ability to respond to the needs of kids exponentially, we just need to make sure that we change our systems. And so part of this is really, you know, because most of this is basic, most of this presentation is basic common sense, I guess you would say. It's nothing really technical, but it's really more of a call to action of how we need to change our systems.
thank you. So we have a question, another question. Where can we find the color wheel?
I think, so I take that from Sources of Strength, but I know you can just basically, I think you can Google it and get several different versions of it. There's different versions of it, you know, some that are a little more complicated and others that are a little more simplistic. So it really just depends on what you what for your needs, what you need for your needs.
Awesome. Are there any other questions or comments out there? Oh, I don't think there's any more comments. So I will wrap it up and close this out. So thank you again so much, Dr. Carey. Again, thank you for this presentation, the last session. We've had such a great turnout. Everyone, please don't forget to fill out your evaluation. If you want to watch Cutting as a Cultural Practice, the first part of Dr. Carey's 2-parts series, please go to the link that I put earlier in the chat box. And then join us next week. We have Dr. Megan O'Connell, our medical epidemiologist here at the Great Plains Tribal Epidemiology Center, and she will be presenting on data on drug use in tribal communities. And then I believe Stacy Eagle Elk will be back to reclaim her position as our facilitator. Thank you all for coming. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.